Creepy Magician presents Requiem for a Prodigal by Tim Novar. Performed by the author. Music by Keith Van Kirk. Sing to me, O Muse, and through me tell my story, and of the one gifted in all ways of conceiving, the prodigal and the protector, and our battle with our darker natures. Chapter 1. Never trouble trouble till trouble troubles you has always been my favorite motto. So why did I leave the cushy paradise known as Mikonos with its libertine attitudes and where I passed by virtually unnoticed by the seasonal partygoers except for the occasional flirtatious glance? And more importantly, why am I now on a ferry headed back to my hometown of Heraklion, a place that I had once sworn I would never return to? Would you believe me if I said it was because of a dream? Or more appropriately, a series of nightmares. After a long night working security at the Pandakion, I would crawl into bed reeking of pipe smoke and stale wine, so tired that I didn't even bother to rinse the stench off in my woefully undersized shower first. Within minutes, I was probably snoring as the welcome respite of darkness engulfed my consciousness. Snippets of chaotic images passed through my mind, often relating to the routine events that had transpired the hours previous. Typically, when I awoke, I would barely remember my dreams, and by the time I was fully awake, crouched beneath the hot shower that began my day, most of the details were forever lost as the nonsensical subconscious ramblings that they were. But for the past 3 nights, I was experiencing something far more intense and disturbing. It began with finding myself paralyzed, lying in bed, struggling to breathe. I became acutely aware of each air exchange to my lungs, convinced that I would suffocate if I stopped concentrating. The only movement I could make was my eyes, and thankfully I was blessed with a broader range of peripheral vision than most. I glanced about my room as much as I was able. I wondered if I was drugged, and an intruder was now lurking in the shadows for some nefarious purpose. My hearing was enhanced as well, and while the loudest sound was my own labored breathing, I could also make out the rhythmic dripping of the antique clepsydra keeping time on my nightstand. Then underneath this came the unmistakable sound of scratching from the south wall. At first, I thought it might have been a rodent scurrying behind the walls, or perhaps a colossal cockroach crawling along the surface. Continuing to listen intently, I soon concluded that it was neither of these things. Creating an intentional scraping designed to get my attention, the thing wanted me to know it was there, and I was at its mercy. I honed in on its origin from my left eye and observed a patch of darkness that seemed more whole than a shadow. It was from the depths of this impossible abyss from which the thing emerged. It was as dark as the gap, and initially I could not make out its outline, but once it detached itself from its entry point to fall at the foot of my bed, I had a better idea of its semblance. It was scrawny to the state of being skeletal, and if I had met it in normal circumstances, I could have quickly snapped it in half. But since I could not convince my muscles to respond to my commands, I was exposed and impotent. Painstakingly slow, it began to crawl its way along the covers towards me. I became convinced that its measured pace was meant to elicit the maximum amount of fear from me, and I'm somewhat ashamed to admit that it had the desired effect. All the while, I was trying to scream in vain, managing only the weakest of bellows. Whatever it was, or whatever its intentions, I had to break its hold on me. Once again, I strained against my immobility, convinced that I could somehow muster just enough movement that would rouse the rest of my body in a cascade of neural rekindling. Since my bed was barely large enough to accommodate my broad frame, I knew that my right side was a mere fraction from the edge. If I could just shift my weight in that direction, I might fall to the floor, hoping the abrupt impact would weaken my torpor. I looked away from the intruder, which had reached my thighs, and focused on willing my body to roll over the side. I could feel my center of gravity shift, and with Herculean effort, I finally felt myself falling toward the floor. I never hit the ground. Instead, I found that I had returned to my original place on the bed. I sighed, convinced that I was now awake. I started to get up so I could shake loose the leftover strands of this nightmare from my mind, only to discover in horror that I was still paralyzed. The scurrying noise had returned to where it began, and the entire horrifying process began once more. I cannot tell you exactly how many times I tried to fight off my nocturnal attacker. I know I must have escaped the confines of my bed at least 7 times, alas to no avail. Worn down and exhausted, at some point I simply surrendered and accepted what was probably my demise, and allowed the shadow fiend to reach my head. I could now hear its ragged panting, and could smell its putrid breath, that smelled of a meat locker in which the power had been turned off for too long. I did not see, but rather sensed its sharp fangs about to plunge into my throat. It was then I would genuinely wake, my heart pounding wildly in my chest to the point where I thought it would burst from my panicked state. Glancing at the clepsydra, I would see that I had only gone to bed a mere half-hour prior, but I knew that I would not be getting any more rest for the remainder of the night. I was used to having nightmares of the usual variety, episodes of frustration or entrapment, such as wandering a labyrinth of endless hallways marked out by doors labeled with numbers in no particular order. In a way, poetically ironic considering what I chose to become, but obviously the symptom of the ordinary life of feeling stuck in the usual rut of daily existence. However, I had never before experienced a recurring event of this magnitude, and after 3 nights of terror-fueled insomnia, I decided to consult a chirurgeon at the local Asclepia. The chirurgeon was a young man, probably fresh from his internship, and possessed the stereotypical look one would expect, complete with a white lab coat, mostly decorative stethoscope, and unfashionable eyeglasses. He diagnosed me as probably having just a bout of sleep paralysis, uncommon but not unusual, most likely brought about by stress or sleep apnea. He prescribed me a mild nighttime sedative and suggested that I get fitted for a positive airflow machine, since guys of my size often had trouble breathing while sleeping as they grew older, my snoring being a prominent symptom. He also explained that the sleeping pill was just a short-term measure, and that I should consult an oracle to deal with whatever psychological issue I was facing that was causing my anxiety. Since I could not afford a true professional, I instead sought out one of the storefront oracles who had set up shop near Platus Gialos Beach, making drachmas of the summer tourists. Sure, they didn't have the fancy office, nor the proper certification nor credentials, and as they often stressed, they were for entertainment purposes only, but I have found that many of them actually possess keen therapeutic insight garnered over years of answering questions from a wide variety of people. Now that it was the quieter winter season, and I was clearly not an out-of-towner, I hoped to get honest advice instead of the typically vague and soothing platitudes. I was prepared to make my intentions clear if I felt I was being handed the usual psalm and sirtaki. As it happened, I need not have worried. While I am confident that the practice had evolved ever since the original Pythian oracle first set up shop at Delphi approximately 3.5 millennia ago, specific procedures were simply traditional and expected to be followed. The storefront had been dressed up to echo the decor one might expect to find at one of the larger, more popular oracles, but still betrayed its decidedly modern construction in the form of well-hidden light switches and electrical outlets. In the front room, I was welcomed by the receptionist, who was undoubtedly related to the priestess inside. He was not overly handsome, as one might expect if the oracle had had a completely free choice in candidates, but his physical appearance was not unattractive either. His outfit was meant to imply an air of mystery, but he didn't seem entirely comfortable projecting that demeanor. His smile seemed less polite artificiality and more genuine hospitality, and I wondered if we ever had met before. After collecting my payment up front, he handed me a supplication card to fill with my personal information and query. I was honest in answering the trivial questions such as my name and address, but when describing the reason for my visit, I simply wrote, "Skip the nonsense, I'm a local." I then folded the card into quarters and handed it back to the receptionist. He proceeded to burn it in a small brazier, expressly designed for the purpose. The paper was scented to release a sweet-smelling aroma as it was consumed, although there was still a vent conveniently located right above it in the ceiling to whisk away the smoke so it didn't cloud the room. While I didn't see the exact moment the switch occurred, I was convinced that the paper I had filled out was not the same card that had been richly burned, because it didn't take too long before the oracle popped her head out from behind the door to the main chamber to see who had written the irreverent message. "Asterius of Heraklion," she exclaimed as soon as she recognized me, for, let's face it, there aren't many on the island who look anything like me. "Cassandra of, well, wherever you hail from," since even though she was a regular at the Pandakion where I worked, I still knew little of her past. "Get in here before anyone else sees us," she quickly whispered, motioning me to join her inside. "You're lucky it's been slow this off-season and no one else happens to be here." She vanished behind the door, and I wasted no time following her. All four walls of her office were painted in a wraparound mural depicting an underground cavern, which I suppose was the same as the chamber at Delphi. The traditional tripod from which she would utter her pronouncements stood in the middle of the room, but she instead dragged a chair from the corner and placed it opposite the seat meant for clients. "To be honest, I hate sitting in that thing," she groused, referring to the tripod. "But it's what the tourists want, and who am I to deny them their fantasies?" She sat in the chair she acquired and indicated that I should have a seat as well. "So, what brings my oft-times protector and rescuer to my humble workplace?" I snorted. While I thought Cassandra was laying it a little thick, I suppose it was also true that I had sometimes kept her safe from the more predatory elements that would occasionally show up and imbibe more than they should. Like her receptionist, she possessed above-average looks, but an inebriated customer might convince themselves that she rivaled Pygmalion's statue. She hung out at my particular Pandakion simply because it was far from Platus Gialis and away from any potential clients. But as such, it was also the sort of place that needed a higher creature like me to maintain order and minimize problems. Thus, I felt it my duty to keep safe those who might need it. It was my turn to seek safety in the form of an explanation for the past 3 nights of hypnagogic torment. I described to Cassandra my plight. She listened carefully with the occasional concerned nod at crucial points of my recounting. When I had finished, she sat back in her chair, swept one side of her shoulder-length auburn hair behind her left ear, took a deep breath, and then offered me her interpretation. "If you were a tourist, I would normally say that there's nothing to worry about. Everything you describe is uncommon, but not unusual." I interrupted. "That's what the Churgeon said." "And yet clearly you don't believe that, or otherwise you wouldn't be here. So I'm going to tell you what you both do and don't want to hear, that there's a supernatural explanation to what you have experienced. I sighed. I was hoping you would tell me that that is nonsense. You don't do what I do for a living by being a complete skeptic, but neither should you be a shut-eye. The woo trappings are because folks want a show, but I've been around enough to know that some things can't be easily explained away as a result of malfunctioning brain wiring. I've seen the Empusa too. Empusa? What is that? You know how the natural philosophers talk of their theories that there are higher dimensions than just the 3 or 4 we perceive? It is my belief that there are entities that are actually projections from a higher dimension into our reality. Our ancestors used to call them by a variety of names, like daemons, for instance. Normally, most daemons are shy and run away as soon as you notice them, but if one is repeatedly attacking you, then you can't simply ignore it and hope it will go away of its own accord. Then you are dealing with an Empusa, a particularly nasty variety of daemon that will gradually drain away your life energy. The physician recommended sleeping pills and a positive airflow machine. Those would just make you more vulnerable. These things go away of their own volition most of the time, seeking fresher prey after their current victim is too weak to provide sufficient sustenance. But my advice is that you should treat it as the harbinger of ill omen that it is, and seek out its source. And how do I do that? You said it manifested from your south wall, right? Well, what lies to the south? I visualized a map in my head. Naxos? True, but do you have any connection to Naxos? I shook my head. Then think further. Beyond Naxos, what lies even further south? Thera? Agid, any connection?